Hi, and welcome to another podcast with Ian Wallace, the Messed Up Counsellor. What I'd like to do today is look at something that's obviously become much more apparent since COVID began, and that's how we work with clients, whether we work face-to-face, whether we work online, Zoom or Meetups or whatever format you use, or whether we work on the telephone, and the differences in that. Now, maybe you're quite okay to work with all three, or email, or sometimes people use email or WhatsApp to do counselling processes. And sometimes we have to think about the right way to deliver our service for that client. And obviously all clients are different. So there might be some clients who want to do face-to-face and won't work online. There are some who prefer to work online, and some who prefer to work on the phone because of their environment and because of time that they have, and lots of reasons. Confidentiality, maybe. There's all sorts of reasons why people prefer one or the other, or a mixture sometimes. But what we have to think about is how we deliver that, the differences, problems that we may encounter by delivering that via the internet, for example. If the internet goes down, what do we do? So we have to have some conversations in our heads, and maybe with our supervisors, if we are going to change our mode of operating into a different format. Now, when I first started working, many years ago now, this internet process wasn't necessarily there, although they were working with email counselling in the early days. So we would work, generally speaking, face to face. And then the organisation started thinking about different ways of connecting, people who couldn't get to the office, people who couldn't have the time to get maybe there, or that were too far away from the office and couldn't get there. So we would then looked at working online, as I said, with email and also telephone. Now, when we started working with telephone, we did a 4 or 5 day course on the differences of working with a telephone connection instead of a face-to-face connection. Now, when we first did that, many years ago now, as I've said, I couldn't really see the relevance initially until I'd done the course. And then it became apparent that there's a lot of differences in the mode that we used to work. And that made me more aware of how it affects me working with different modes of connection and how it affects the client. So one of the things that surprised me, to be fair, when working with a telephone was that I didn't realise how much I would need to concentrate, more so than being face to face. And they said at the time of the training, well, we normally do 40-minute sessions on the phone, and we do 50 minutes or an hour face to face. And so that's obviously, now I look back and I go, well, of course, but at the time it wasn't apparent, because in order to give the client as much of your concentration as possible, then you need to really concentrate on what's being said through your ears, obviously with the phone. And that made me conscious of how much we take in by the different modes that we use and how much we take them in differently. So when I'm on the phone working, my concentration is more enhanced because I'm only taking it in through that one sense of sound. Whereas if I'm working face to face, I'm working with my eyes and I'm working with my ears. So it's amazing for me in that first early days when we were working with that training, how much I was able to take in which was not being verbalized on the phone, such as their emotional well-being, such as of how their words were being delivered, and working with slight changes of voice in how I then put that together, how I then made sense of that conversation, that world that that client was giving me. And because I was concentrating enormously hard with that telephone counselling, I could then understand why we were only doing 40-minute sessions, because it was really, really hard to kind of keep that level of concentration going. And when we're working with that, we obviously then had to think about, well, where is the client working from? Are they working from home? Are they working on the bus? Are they working in their car? Are they walking in the park? Are they sat down? So again, there was another aspect of, I need some indication of what the external environment's going to be in order to work out whether it's okay, whether it's confidential, because it could be that they're talking in a cafe, and how that might affect the work that we do. So again, there was a lot of engaging with differences, diversity, and different outcomes, and how I might work with that differently. For example, if a client was talking to me about something really emotional and they were in a coffee shop, then would I want that conversation to be something other people could hear, basically, or they could hear their side of it, or if they had it on speakerphone, hopefully not, but if they did, then they could hear my words. And B, can they cope if they become emotional in that process? People around them might start looking at them when they're crying or sobbing, because that attention might be on them. So would that be helpful for the client? Would that put them in a more pressurized, more sensitive kind of a process? So thinking about what I was dealing with the client, and how much trauma maybe I was working with, was a definite consideration of what mode I used or I engaged with. And sometimes that's not something you know straight off. Sometimes it is, obviously, they come in and tell you exactly what they, or even preliminary with an assessment, they come in and tell you exactly what they want and what they're going to work with. Sometimes it's something you find along the way, and it's a shock to them as it's a shock to you sometimes. So engaging with the different formats of delivery is helpful to have a think about what it is you are going to work with and what it is you feel comfortable with. And I suppose safeguarding the client emotionally might be a consideration. Can they take it? Confidentiality is another format as well, because we're not able to see their environment or who's around them. We've only got their word for where they are, quite naturally. Then it might be very hard, that they might say something that isn't helpful in their environment to maybe another family friend. Maybe somebody's listening in the door, in the bedroom, maybe somebody's around. So in order to deliver that counselling, we have to do some kind of conversation about where are you, what's going on around you, what happens if signal gets lost, if they're driving, should they be driving while they're having a counselling session? So we have to be mindful of all those kind of environmental things that might be actually dangerous if they were still driving to have. So we have to try and have a conversation about what's more appropriate. What's the best way to have that conversation? And if it isn't appropriate, then we would need to say that, because it's for their benefit as well as ours, quite naturally. So when we're looking at all those different ways of working, and now a lot of things are being walk and talk therapy, which is another way of delivering, that is different to what we would have encountered a few years ago. It's becoming much more popular nowadays. But with that, there's different things that we need to think about within our client that they may not have thought about. So we have to sometimes broach those conversations and see how they would relate to that and what would happen if, So that process of walk and talk therapy, which I say is becoming more popular, still has its own peculiar characteristics of what would help and not help the work. So having those conversations with the client before we interact with the counselling is helpful to get them to think about what are we going to do if, what happens when. And obviously from our point of view, we need to know that A, the client's safe, naturally, that it's confidential, nobody else is going to hear it so they can use it against the client, and whether it's something that's functionally okay, as in driving while having a counselling session. It's not safe and it's not functionally okay. So we'd have to kind of put some boundaries in with that. We'd have to say, no, actually, maybe we don't do it this way. Maybe we do it that way. So those kind of situation scenarios are many and varied, obviously. Lots of things can happen or could be part of that conversation. You might think about if they were had a young child, a baby, in the room with them when they were counselling. So whether that's at their home or your office or your place of work, that will create a difference. That will create some aspect of interruption, maybe. If they're young and they start crying, want the nappy change, they want some milk, they want to feed. So from that point of view, again, there's those kind of aspects of the client's world that we need to be mindful of, because it will differently engage with the client. Now, I have a rule with clients that I don't see clients in the office when they've got a child. Now, in my world, I would possibly think that if that parental figure was being upset, then in the environment, the child possibly would pick that up. And would that be helpful for the child? So I don't have children in the room with the parents, unless it's obviously planned, family counselling. So those kind of things are quite hard to sometimes make boundaries over. Sometimes can give the parents an understanding of how that might affect that young child, and how that might be hard for the parent to kind of open up and be fully congruent and fully connected in the work, because they may be scared of how that child is going to be affected, So things happen, they just do. You might get, as I've had in the past, a couple walking into the first session and never seen them before with 2 dogs, one each. Now, that's at the doorstep of the office. So I'm presented with this process. I'm not aware of this process prior. So then we have to have conversations around, okay, so what do we do now? This is not what I was expecting. And they're both coming in with a dog each. And it's not my house, it's not my office, I rent the office. Can I have animals in the office? Consideration from the landlord's point of view. They might say no, unless it's obviously a dog that's like a sight dog, or a dog that works with behavioural epilepsy and those kind of things, to get dogs nowadays that show triggers of those things coming on. So it might be a kind of a service dog, if you like, but they worked. So then I have to think, well, okay, what do I do? Do I hold this session? Do I not hold this session? And there's a lot of variables in there that we won't know about. If the dog did, unfortunately, wee on the carpet or whatever, then who's going to pay for the cleaning? Where's that going to come from? There's a whole range of things that you would have to have a conversation about. So with me, and it is only me, I'm not saying you need to work this way, but it's about having to think about these possibilities. With me, it's the person that's in the room that needs to be in the room and nobody else. And that aspect of work works better for me, and I think probably better for the client, to be fair, if there isn't those distractions and those processes. So you might find that somebody does come to the counselling session face to face with a baby, because they can't do anything else. You know, the baby needs somebody to be in charge and control of them and look after them, care for them. So it might be we need a conversation about that. But whatever conversation you're going to have, it's about the benefit for the work and the benefit for the client, and obviously if there's a baby. So we're looking at assessing those kind of interactions, those kind of boundaries of what's okay, what's not okay, what will help, what will help. And doing that is easier face to face, obviously. But if somebody's at home and on the telephone, then you can't just say, well, you know, can you get rid of your baby for the next hour? You know, if the baby's there, the baby's there. And they're in their domain, they're in their home, they're in their environment. So you would need to work with that. But having to think about these situations prior to them happening, which is always a good idea, as to what would you do if, what would you do when. Now, if you're working online, then you might be working with Zoom or Meetups or any of those kind of processes. You may be more in control because you can see what's going on around, but you can only see where the camera's showing. You're not seeing the rest of the office. Now, you see me in a corner with a table at the side, sat down with a lamp behind me. You're not seeing anything else. Now, to all your intents and purposes, there could be 3 or 4 people behind me at the camera, and they could be listening to what I'm saying. Maybe not interacting, but listening. Now, you may never know. There isn't, obviously. I'm here on my own. But there may be, and you then have to have some understanding of what would you do if you heard somebody else talking. You kind of saw a shadow move in the background, you know, and that process, that aspect of feeling that you know what's going on and what's around is helpful because you're more able to control the environment to the benefit of the client and the work you're doing. It's not you making necessarily demands on the client. There's a rationale for the reasoning for it. It's not just because you say so. And if you can give that rationale to the client, like the baby in the room kind of thing, you know, once I made the couple aware that the baby might be affected by this process and have a duty of care to their baby as well as the clients, then there was an adult conversation around that. It wasn't just me being, you know, Mardy and saying, you know, you can't have a baby in here. So that process means I'm bringing them on board, on side, for the reasoning of why I'm doing what I'm doing. And that works as much as it can work, because you can't cover every situation, scenario, as I've said. But it's about making those people aware of the benefits and the drawbacks. And that aspect is one that conversation, communication with clients is obviously helpful, so that they can think about those kind of processes and how that works. When you're working with situations that might be abusive in the client's kind of world, then again that's something to consider, because is that something where the abuser is able to see or hear what we're talking about? And if they're not in the office, obviously you've no idea about that, certainly nowadays with the way that technology works. And that process means that you would have to think about what is okay to talk about, what is okay to open up and share. And maybe more conversations about who is there, what would happen if somebody came in. And if you do see some indication that there's somebody there by a noise or a shadow or something moving, then you have to think about, well, okay, what do I do in that situation? Do I just carry on? Do I bring that into the conversation? Just notice there's some movement around it here. Is somebody else there now? You know? And those kind of things might be something you would have to do. Or maybe before you start the process in your contracting, You have to say, well, actually, this is the way it works, and if this happens, then I'm going to do this, that, or the other, and try and give them some kind of pre-notice of what you're okay with, what you're not okay with. So there's many things to consider, just as I did when I did that telephone counselling course, that I wasn't aware of previous to that. But there's many things to consider in the work that we do and how we deliver it. And what is right for one client might not be right for another. But the clients may not have thought about those things. They might not have considered those aspects of somebody maybe eavesdropping. For nowadays, when you've got kind of Alexa and all these kind of formats, then people can pick up on that while not in the room, maybe not even in the house or the flats, and they can hear the conversation. So should you now have part of your contracting of confidentiality and data protection, a part that says all electronic devices need to be switched off before we engage in a counselling session. It's a thing to think about, because if somebody else is aware of what you're saying, or even recording what you're saying with the client, that could be detrimental to the client. But maybe again, the client hasn't thought about that. So we need to bring that into the conversation as a possibility in order to make it easier for them to think about all those possible variables. Whatever mode you use, you will be familiar with it now. So if all your work up to now has been face-to-face, and after COVID and we all went online because we couldn't do anything else, basically there was a massive surge in working online and working on the telephone, and that people hadn't been able to pre-train for, obviously, because nobody knew COVID was going to happen. So that process meant there was a lot of people kind of thrown into this process of connection and working differently, and there wasn't enough time to kind of get accustomed to all those possibilities. But now obviously maybe you can. So if you're thinking about offering walk and talk, if you think about offering telephone, email, Zoom or internet kind of process, then you need to have a think about before you do it about these items that we've talked about today, because there will be differences quite naturally that you'll have to consider. Hopefully that's opened your mind up to possibilities of things to talk about, things to kind of think about. And maybe that in itself will be helpful. If you liked today, then please like, share, subscribe. My name's Ian Wallace. I'm the Messed Up Counsellor. Messed up because I think all of us human beings are messed up. There is no normal. We are all pieces of somebody else's ideas that they've given to us as we've grown up, and then formulate our own ideas based on other people's ideas. We're never born with a world. I think we're all dysfunctional. I think that's healthy. And so the Messed Up Counsellor was born from that consideration. But it's an interesting title. A lot of my colleagues within the counselling fraternity were very against the idea of the title. A lot of the people who are not counsellors find it intriguing, and because it's intriguing, it's interesting, and they do kind of connect to it and find it refreshing that even a counsellor hasn't got all the answers, and we don't, unfortunately. We are still human beings, not robots. So I'm Ian Wallace. I'm the Messed Up Counsellor. Take care. Have a great day.